On the most vulnerable day of her life, she gripped the cold rails of the delivery bed, every contraction shaking her to the core, crying out for her husband, only to find him gone. He stood at a wedding arch, tailored tuxedo, next to his CEO boss in a scene that felt ripped from another reality. In that split second, a promise of comfort turned into a betrayal so devastating it rewrote both their destinies. He thought he was choosing ambition, choosing power, choosing a new life. Yet he had no idea that the woman he abandoned had just signed a deal worth $100 million. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What would drive a man like Daniel to turn his back on Emily at the very hour she needed him most? For years, he had played the role of devoted husband, sharing whispered promises about family and loyalty. Yet in that delivery room he chose absence over presence, silence over comfort, and walked directly into another woman's arms. Was it truly love that pulled him away? A sudden fire with his wealthy CEO? Or was it something else entirely? A hunger for status? A desperate chase for a life he could never build on his own? And what about Emily? Left abandoned in pain and fear, unaware that her own strength and brilliance would soon transform into a $100 million revelation that not only exposed Daniel's betrayal, but turned it into the very foundation of her triumph. This isn't just a story of love and betrayal. It's a story of wealth, ambition, and the shocking revenge no one saw coming. Emily Hart was not the kind of woman anyone expected to be underestimated. From a small-town childhood to the sharp, unyielding boardrooms of the city, she built her reputation step by step, proving herself in spaces where women were often silenced or overlooked. Those who knew her described her as strong but tender, a woman who carried ambition in one hand and compassion in the other. As her pregnancy progressed, Emily balanced late nights reviewing contracts with quiet afternoons painting the nursery walls, her laughter echoing through baby showers, her friends marveling at how she could lead a business meeting in the morning and still find joy in folding tiny baby clothes by night. To her, motherhood and leadership were not contradictions, but extensions of her resilience. Daniel, on the other hand, carried himself with charm that once seemed disarming. A man who could win strangers with a smile, yet struggled to hold his footing in a career that never quite rose to meet his expectations. He was ambitious, but ambition without grounding often leaves a hollow ache, and Daniel felt it deeply. He watched Emily succeed where he stumbled, watched her name move upward while his stalled, and though he smiled at her victories, there was a quiet storm building inside him. He told himself it was pride for her, yet in private moments the shadow of resentment grew. Enter the CEO, a woman of power and wealth, the kind of magnetic figure who knew how to bend those around her into instruments for her vision. She saw in Daniel not a partner in brilliance, but a man hungry for validation, a pawn easily drawn into her orbit with the promise of status and fortune. And as Emily decorated a crib with hope and expectation, subtle shifts crept into Daniel's behavior. The late-night phone calls he didn't explain, the distant look in his eyes when Emily asked about the future, the moments when his once steady presence began to feel like absence. To Emily, these were small cracks in the surface of a marriage she believed in. To Daniel, they were the first steps toward a decision that would change everything. The day of delivery began like a storm Emily Hart had both dreaded and prepared for, her body racked with contractions, each wave of pain pushing her closer to the moment she had waited 9 months to meet. She reached for Daniel, searching for the steady hand of the man who had once promised to never leave her side, but found him distracted, pacing at the edge of the room, his phone glowing in his palm as if the messages it carried were more urgent than the life about to enter the world. His suitcase was packed in the corner, a silent betrayal that Emily, through her exhaustion, could hardly process. She whispered through the pain, her voice trembling, "Please, I need you." But Daniel's reply was cold, his eyes fixed elsewhere, his tone stripped of the tenderness she once knew. "You'll be fine. I have somewhere I need to be." And in that moment, The bond of marriage cracked into something unrecognizable. As Emily screamed through the agony of childbirth, tears streaking her face, Daniel walked out of the hospital, the echo of her cries trailing behind him like a wound he chose to ignore. The camera of fate then shifted to another scene entirely, one so lavish it seemed obscene in contrast. A wedding arch dressed in white roses, guests in glittering gowns, music swelling with joy, and Daniel, standing tall in a tuxedo beside the CEO, smiling for cameras and promises of wealth that had nothing to do with love. At the very same hour Emily was fighting for life and clutching at hope, Daniel was pledging loyalty to another woman, a boss whose power and fortune dazzled him far more than the cries of his newborn child. But Daniel had no idea the papers Emily signed that very morning, before the contractions began, would change everything, turning his betrayal into the seed of his greatest downfall. Emily Hart gave birth alone, her cries echoing through the sterile walls of the delivery room, unanswered by the man who had vowed to stand beside her. Nurses exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers carrying pity and disbelief as the reality of her abandonment sank in. Word spread quickly within the hospital corridors. Daniel was not there, not because of an accident or an emergency, but because he had chosen to stand at another altar, beside the CEO who promised him the kind of life his insecurities craved. When photos of the extravagant wedding began to surface online, headlines followed within hours. Husband leaves wife in labor to marry CEO boss. Outrage spread like wildfire across social circles and media platforms, strangers appalled at the coldness of Daniel's choice. But behind the veil of scandal, another story emerged, one that would shift the narrative entirely. While the world painted Emily as the abandoned wife, documents revealed she was far more than that. She was the architect of a groundbreaking $100 million deal signed just hours before her contractions began. The paperwork bore her name, her signature, her foresight, and the revelation stunned those who had dismissed her as simply a victim. Reports surfaced describing Emily as a formidable strategist, a woman whose boardroom victories rivaled the pain of her personal betrayal. She wasn't just a wife, one article declared, she was a force in the boardroom. And as this truth circulated, Daniel's carefully constructed image of ambition and loyalty began to fracture. To the public, his story no longer resembled romance or passion. It looked like calculation, a betrayal not rooted in love but in greed, a choice to abandon a family for the illusion of wealth through proximity to the CEO. With every revelation, Daniel's narrative cracked further, exposing a man who had underestimated not only the strength of the woman he left behind, but also the consequences of a decision that the world was now watching unfold with judgment and fascination. While Daniel pledged himself to another woman, exchanging vows with the CEO beneath glittering lights and rose-covered arches, Emily Hart had already written a very different story. Hours before the contractions began, before she was left to face delivery alone, she signed a contract that would rewrite her future forever. A $100 million deal that placed her in a league Daniel could scarcely imagine. It was not just a transaction, it was a declaration of independence, a safeguard of her power, and an iron wall protecting her child's future. Daniel, meanwhile, believed he had secured victory. To him, the CEO's wealth meant security, prestige, and entry into the kind of circles where men whispered about influence over brandy and cigars. He smiled in photographs, wrapped his arm around her, convinced that by stepping away from Emily, he had stepped into a golden age of opportunity. But while he reveled in champagne toasts and honeymoon promises, Emily quietly maneuvered in the shadows of legality and strategy. With precision, she ensured that the assets they once shared could never be claimed by the man who walked out on her. She tied her fortune to airtight clauses, strengthened her position with advisors who respected her brilliance, and secured the kind of financial independence that could not be undone by betrayal. Daniel thought the CEO had elevated him, but the truth was far colder. He had no stake in Emily's triumph, no claim to the deal that had already begun reshaping her life. His choice had left him not richer, but powerless. And when Daniel came back for what he believed was his, whether property, money, or the legacy he thought he could demand. Emily was waiting. When the truth finally reached the courtroom, the story of Daniel and Emily Hart unfolded like a cautionary tale written in public record. Divorce proceedings filled the benches with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers, each waiting to hear how a man could abandon his wife on the day of delivery and still believe he deserved a share of her hard-earned triumph. Emily entered quietly, dressed not in extravagance, but in dignity. Her child held close in her arms, a living reminder of the day she was left alone yet unbroken. Daniel entered separately, his once confident stride dulled by the weight of scrutiny, his eyes darting nervously as the evidence was laid bare. Then came the moment that would define everything. Emily's lawyer, with deliberate precision, presented the contract, the $100 million deal signed solely under her name, shielded by clauses Daniel had no right to touch. The revelation fell heavy across the courtroom, erasing whatever hope Daniel clung to. He had no claim, no leverage, no path to the fortune he thought was his by association. The empire Emily built stood untouched, her child's future secured, her independence undeniable. And as the judge ruled, the silence that followed was more powerful than any gavel strike. Emily rose, gathered her child, and walked out with the strength of a woman who had endured the worst and emerged victorious. Daniel sat frozen, helpless, watching everything he thought he controlled slip further out of reach, not to another rival, but to the very woman he underestimated. In chasing power, Daniel lost everything: his wife, his child, his future, and even the illusion of wealth he thought he inherited by standing beside the CEO. The empire he imagined had never been his to begin with. And so the story closes with a truth as sharp as the betrayal that started it. Betrayal cuts deep, but sometimes the cruelest betrayal is the one that builds an empire. And so, as Emily Hart stepped into a new life defined not by betrayal but by triumph, the question remains: was justice truly served? Or was this merely a story of revenge dressed in the garments of success? Daniel lost his wife, his child, and the very future he once imagined, left only with the memory of choices that could never be undone. The CEO he married offered him wealth and appearance, but even that illusion was hollow compared to the empire Emily quietly built for herself. Some will say Daniel deserved every ounce of what he lost. Others will wonder if Emily's strength, though admirable, carried a shadow of retribution too sharp to ignore. What would you have done if you were Emily Hart, abandoned in that hospital room, left to raise a child alone, yet holding in your hands the power of a $100 million deal? Was her victory simply survival, or was it a reckoning meant to balance a betrayal too great to forgive? Comment your thoughts below. We want to hear your voice in this conversation. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear the account of the billionaire who faked his own death to protect a fortune no one ever knew existed. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.